Walter Bramble and the Boat That Never Sailed. Chapter 1. The Stranger at Gull's Haven. Walter Bramble had never understood holidays. He understood days out. A day out had structure. One left home after breakfast, visited somewhere with a tea room, looked at something old, bought a postcard, and returned before the milk needed bringing in. A holiday was different. A holiday involved abandoning one's ordinary life for several days and trusting that everything would remain where it was until one returned. It required suitcases, unfamiliar pillows, complicated arrangements concerning houseplants, and the deeply unsettling possibility that someone else might have used the kettle. Walter preferred home. At home, he knew which stair creaked, which cupboard door required lifting before it would close, and precisely how long the kitchen tap must run before the water stopped tasting faintly of pipes. He knew the morning habits of the blackbird that sat on the fence, the afternoon habits of the woman from number 12 who inspected everyone's recycling, and the evening habits of the ginger cat that belonged to nobody but behaved as if Walter's garden had been left to it in a will. Home, Walter believed, was the place where objects had learned to tolerate you. This was why, when Mrs. Finch suggested that he take a holiday, Walter reacted as though she had proposed he join the merchant navy. "A holiday?" he said. Mrs. Finch looked at him over the top of her spectacles. They were sitting in the little room behind the library desk, where Mrs. Finch kept the biscuit tin, the spare date stamp, and several notices she did not consider suitable for public display. One of these notices read, "Please do not leave vegetables in the return box." This had been written after an incident involving 3 marrows, a bag of runner beans, and a badly damaged atlas. "Yes," said Mrs. Finch. "A holiday." Walter considered the word again. "Where? Somewhere else? That seems rather broad." "That is generally the purpose." Mrs. Finch poured tea into 2 mismatched cups. Walter's cup showed a faded picture of a castle he had never visited. Mrs. Finch's had the words, "World's Best Aunt" on the side, despite her insisting that none of her nieces or nephews had given it to her. "I'm perfectly content here," Walter said. "That is precisely the difficulty." Walter frowned. "I don't see how contentment can be a difficulty." "It can become one when it prevents a person from doing anything unfamiliar. I went to the new chemist last Tuesday." "You stood outside for 7 minutes and then went back to the old chemist." "The lighting was very aggressive." Mrs. Finch pushed a plate of biscuits towards him. "You've been restless lately." "I have not." "You reorganized your shed." "It required reorganizing." "You reorganized it twice." "The first reorganization revealed flaws." "You also alphabetized your seed packets." Walter reached for a biscuit. "That was common sense." "You put courgettes under seed." Walter paused. "They are sometimes called zucchini." "You have never called them zucchini in your life." Walter bit into the biscuit. It was a custard cream, though very little in it appeared to contain custard or cream. Mrs. Finch watched him with the calm patience of someone who had already decided the outcome of the conversation. "I have found you somewhere," she said. Walter stopped chewing. "That sounds ominous. A cottage by the sea. I don't particularly like sand." "It is near a harbour. Harbours are full of ropes." Mrs. Finch stared at him. Walter lowered the biscuit. "I have nothing against ropes in principle, but they do tend to lie about in an untidy manner. The cottage belongs to my cousin Margaret." "You have a cousin called Margaret?" "I have several cousins called Margaret. It was a popular name." "Which one is this?" "The one with the cottage." Walter accepted that this was probably as much clarification as he would receive. Mrs. Finch opened a drawer and took out a small brochure. On the front was a photograph of a seaside village huddled around a narrow harbour. White cottages climbed the hill behind it. Fishing boats rested against the quay, and gulls wheeled above the slate roofs. The photograph appeared to have been taken on the only sunny day the village had ever experienced. The title read, "Gull's Haven, where the land meets the sea." Walter studied it. Where else would the land meet the sea? Mrs. Finch ignored this. The cottage is available next week. Margaret usually rents it during the summer, but there has been a cancellation. Why? I didn't ask. Walter looked more closely at the photograph. At the far side of the harbour stood a weathered stone building with a green door. Beyond it, tied to an old wooden mooring, was a dark-hulled fishing boat. The boat looked older than the others. Its paint was fresh, but its shape belonged to another time. Walter noticed it only briefly. Then he returned the brochure. It looks pleasant. Mrs. Finch smiled. Walter recognized this expression. It meant she had won. Packing took Walter 2 days. This was not because he owned a great many clothes, but because he found it difficult to decide what might be required beside the sea. He packed a raincoat, then removed it because the weather forecast was favorable. He packed it again because weather forecasts were written by optimists. He added a woolen jumper, a second woolen jumper, a pair of stout shoes, and a pair of shoes he considered less stout but more presentable. He packed 4 books, removed 2, replaced 1, and then added a guide to coastal birds that had belonged to his father. The guide had been published in 1958 and included several birds Walter suspected had since changed their names. He also packed biscuits. Walter distrusted accommodation that described itself as fully equipped. In his experience, this usually meant there were 6 wine glasses, but no decent knife for cutting bread. On the morning of his departure, he stood in the hall beside his suitcase and looked around the house. Everything seemed to be waiting. The clock ticked. The umbrella stand leaned slightly to one side. From the kitchen came the sound of the refrigerator doing whatever refrigerators did when they believed nobody was listening. Walter picked up his suitcase. Then he put it down again and checked the back door. He returned to the hall. He picked up the suitcase. Then he remembered the bathroom window. By the time he finally left, he had checked the cooker 3 times, the taps twice, and the front door once from the inside and twice from the outside. Mrs. Finch had arranged for a local driver named Dennis to take him to Gull's Haven. Dennis arrived in a blue car that smelled faintly of peppermints and wet dog, although no dog was visible. "You Walter?" he asked. "Yes." "Mrs. Finch said you'd have a suitcase." Walter looked down at the suitcase. She was correct. Dennis opened the boot. The boot contained a folding chair, a fishing net, 2 empty fuel cans, and a box labelled "Do not turn upside down." Dennis turned the box sideways to make room. "Plenty of space?" he said. Walter placed his suitcase carefully beside it. The journey took just over 2 hours. Dennis talked for almost all of them. He spoke about roadworks, potholes, parking charges, the decline of proper tomatoes, and a man in a nearby village who had built a conservatory without consulting anyone. Walter contributed where necessary. Mostly he watched the countryside change. The familiar flat fields gave way to low hills. Hedges grew thicker. Roads narrowed and twisted between banks of wildflowers. Eventually, the air through the half-open window began to smell different. Saltier, colder, and somehow larger. They reached the coast shortly after midday. The road descended steeply between cottages, and suddenly the sea appeared ahead. Walter had seen the sea many times, but it always surprised him. It seemed too large to belong to the same world as dustbins and bus timetables. At Gull's Haven, the road ended beside the harbour wall. Dennis stopped the car. "Well," he said, "this is it." Walter looked through the windscreen. The village curved around a narrow harbour no wider than a village green. Stone cottages with whitewashed walls stood shoulder to shoulder along the quay. Nets hung from iron hooks. Lobster pots were stacked beside doors. Small boats rocked on the water, knocking softly against the stone. Beyond the harbour mouth, the sea shone beneath a pale sky. A gull landed on the bonnet. Dennis stared at it. The gull stared back. "Don't encourage them," Dennis said. "I haven't done anything." "They take that as encouragement." The gull tapped the windscreen with its beak. Dennis sounded the horn. The gull did not move. Eventually Dennis got out and waved both arms. The Gull stepped aside by approximately 6 inches. Walter collected his suitcase. "Enjoy yourself," Dennis said. "I shall attempt to. If you need picking up early, give me a ring." "Why would I need picking up early?" Dennis glanced towards the Gull. "You never know." Then he drove away. Walter stood alone on the quay. A cold breeze lifted the edge of his coat. Somewhere nearby, a bell rang. Ropes creaked. Water slapped gently against the harbour wall. Walter consulted the note Mrs. Finch had given him. "Rose Cottage. Ask for Margaret Penrose at the Sea Lantern Cafe." He looked around. There were 3 cafes. One was called the Sea Lantern. Another was called the Lantern by the Sea. The third was simply called Lanterns. Walter suspected this had caused avoidable confusion over the years. He chose the first. The Sea Lantern Cafe occupied the corner of a blue-painted building overlooking the harbour. In the window stood a row of cakes beneath glass covers, several postcards and a handwritten notice. "Cream teas, served all day." Underneath, in smaller writing, someone had added, "Unless we run out of cream." A brass bell sounded as Walter opened the door. Inside, the cafe was warm and crowded with small round tables. The walls were covered with framed photographs of fishing boats, lifeboat crews, and severe-looking men holding enormous fish. Behind the counter, a woman with silver hair was arranging scones on a plate. She looked up. "You'll be Walter." Walter stopped. "Yes." "I'm Margaret." Mrs. Finch's cousin. One of them. Margaret came around the counter and shook his hand. She wore a flower-dusted apron and a brooch shaped like a crab. "You're earlier than I expected." "I wasn't given a particular time." "Nobody is, but they're usually later." Walter did not know how to answer this. Margaret looked at his suitcase. "You've packed for weather." "I thought it sensible." "It is. We get a great deal of weather here." She took a key from a hook. "Rose Cottage is just along the quay. Number 7, green door, blue flower pot, loose step." "Which step?" "You'll find out." Margaret handed him the key. "Tea first?" Walter looked towards the cakes. "That might be prudent." "Sit by the window." Walter took the table overlooking the harbour. Margaret brought him a pot of tea and a scone large enough to require planning. "Jam first or cream first?" she asked. Walter considered the question carefully. "Does it matter?" Margaret looked towards the kitchen. "Not to me, but don't say that too loudly." Walter spread the jam first, mainly because it was nearer. As he ate, he watched the harbour. A fisherman in yellow waterproof trousers mended a net beside a stack of crates. 2 children were trying to persuade a spaniel to enter the water. The spaniel appeared to have made a firm decision concerning the sea and was resisting with all 4 legs. Near the far wall stood an elderly man polishing a brass lamp. He wore a navy jumper and a peaked cap. His back was straight and his movements were slow and precise. The brass lamp was already gleaming, but he continued polishing it. Walter noticed the old fishing boat again. It was moored beyond the harbour office, slightly apart from the others. The hull was painted deep blue with a narrow red stripe. Its name, Evelyn May, had been picked out in gold lettering along the bow. The boat was immaculate. Fresh ropes secured it to the quay. Its metal fittings shone. A folded tarpaulin lay neatly across the stern. Yet something about it seemed still. The other boats moved with the tide, tugging at their ropes as though impatient to leave. The Evelyn May barely shifted. "Fine old boat," Walter said when Margaret returned. She followed his gaze. For the first time since Walter had met her, her expression changed. Only slightly, but enough. "Yes," she said. "She is." "Does she still go out?" Margaret began gathering empty cups from the next table. "No." "Engine trouble?" "No." "Too old?" Margaret paused. "Boats aren't always kept because people intend to use them." Then she carried the cups away. Walter looked back towards the harbour. The old man had stopped polishing the lamp. He was watching Walter through the cafe window. Rose Cottage stood 5 doors from the cafe. It was smaller than Walter had expected and slightly more crooked. The walls were painted cream, the windows leaned inward. The green front door looked as though it had been fitted by someone who distrusted straight lines. A blue flower pot stood beside the step. Walter found the loose stone immediately. Inside, the cottage was cool and smelled faintly of lavender, old wood, and the sea. The sitting room contained a small fireplace, 2 armchairs, and a bookshelf filled mostly with detective novels. A narrow staircase climbed to a bedroom beneath the roof. The kitchen was at the back. Walter inspected it carefully. There were 6 wine glasses. There was no decent knife for cutting bread. He unpacked his biscuits with satisfaction. From the bedroom window, Walter could see the entire harbour. The cottage stood high enough above the quay for him to look across the rooftops of the boats. The harbour curved beneath him like a stone bowl. Beyond the narrow entrance lay the open sea. The Evelyn May was clearly visible at the far end. Walter watched as the old man in the peaked cap crossed the quay towards it. He stepped aboard without hesitation and began checking the ropes. A few minutes later he climbed off again. He locked a small hatch, tested it twice and walked away. Walter placed his shirts in the wardrobe. He told himself the boat was none of his concern. He had come to rest. He had come to read. He had come to discover whether sitting beside the sea felt significantly different from sitting anywhere else. He had not come to ask questions. This decision lasted until 4:30. The village pub was called the Anchor and Crown, although the sign outside showed only an anchor. The crown had apparently fallen off during a storm in 1987 and had never been replaced. Walter entered because he needed something for his evening meal and because Margaret had told him the pub served proper food. Inside, dark beams crossed the ceiling. A fire burned in the grate despite it being late spring. 3 men sat at the bar in silence, looking as if they had been placed there when the building opened and had never found a reason to leave. The landlord, a broad man with a red face and a magnificent grey moustache, approached Walter. "You'll be the gentleman at Rose Cottage." Walter looked around. No introductions had been made. "Yes. Thought so." "How?" The landlord glanced towards the 3 men. "News travels." Walter had been in the village for 4 hours. He considered this. "What would you like?" the landlord asked. Walter ordered fish pie and a half pint of bitter. One of the men at the bar turned on his stool. "Bramble, isn't it?" "Yes." "I'm Ned Pritchard." The man beside him nodded. "Tom Vale." The third lifted 2 fingers. "Arthur Moss." Walter introduced himself, though this seemed unnecessary. "You staying long?" Ned asked. "1 week." "They all say that," said Tom. "Who does?" "Visitors." "What do they say later?" "Depends on the weather." Arthur took a sip from his glass. "Or the gulls." As if summoned, something struck the window outside. Walter looked round. A gull was standing on the sill with a chip in its beak. "That one's called Malcolm," said Ned. "Why?" "Looks like a Malcolm." The gull swallowed the chip. "Does it belong to anyone?" Walter asked. "No," said Tom. "Nobody would admit it." Walter's fish pie arrived in a dish deep enough to require excavation. As he ate, the men discussed the tide, a broken freezer at the village shop, and whether a boat owned by someone named Colin had been painted the wrong shade of green. Walter listened. Eventually, there was a pause. He nodded towards the window. "Whose is the Evelyn May?" The effect was immediate. Ned looked into his glass. Tom examined the fire. Arthur suddenly became interested in a framed lifeboat certificate on the wall. The landlord wiped the same patch of counter 3 times. Walter waited. At last, Ned said, "Old boat. Yes. Been there years." "So I gathered." Tom cleared his throat. "Nice fish pie?" "Very. Pam makes it." "Does she?" "Every Thursday." It was Monday. Walter suspected this was not the point. "Who owns the boat?" he asked again. Arthur turned slowly. "Depends what you mean by owns." Walter looked at him. "I mean, whose boat is it?" That's what I thought you meant. The landlord placed a clean glass beneath the counter. You need anything else, Mr. Bramble? No, thank you. Walter returned to his meal. The men resumed their discussion of Colin's green paint, but the conversation had changed. It was more deliberate now, each sentence chosen with care. When Walter left the pub, the light was beginning to fade. Lamps glowed in the cottage windows. The sea beyond the harbour had turned silver-grey. A line of cloud rested along the horizon. Walter walked slowly back towards Rose Cottage. The village was quieter now. The cafe had closed. The fisherman had gone. The spaniel had apparently escaped the children and was asleep beneath a bench. At the far end of the quay, the Evelyn May lay in shadow. Walter stopped. Someone was standing on the deck. He could not see the person clearly. Only a dark figure near the stern bent over the hatch. Walter watched. The figure straightened. For a moment it seemed to turn towards him. Then it stepped down into the boat and disappeared. Walter waited. Nobody emerged. He looked along the quay. There was no one nearby. The harbour office was dark. The old man in the peaked cap was nowhere to be seen. Walter told himself that one of the fishermen had gone aboard to check something. There was nothing unusual about a person standing on a boat in a harbour. It would have been far more unusual if they had been standing in a bakery. Still, he remained where he was. A loose halyard tapped softly against a mast. The water shifted beneath the boat. Then, from somewhere aboard the Evelyn May, came the faint sound of music. Only a few notes, thin and distant, the kind of music played from an old radio late at night. Walter stepped closer. The music stopped. A gull cried from the roof of the harbour office. Behind Walter, a voice said, "Best leave her be." Walter turned. The elderly man from the harbour stood several yards away. Up close he looked older than Walter had first thought. His face was deeply lined, browned by years of weather. The peaked cap bore a faded harbour badge. "I beg your pardon," Walter said. "The boat? I thought I saw someone aboard." The old man looked towards the Evelyn May. "No one aboard." "There was." "No. I heard music." The old man's expression did not change. "Sound carries over water." "From where?" "Everywhere." Walter glanced back at the boat. The deck was empty. The old man came nearer. "You're Walter Bramble." It was not a question. Walter sighed. "Does everyone know?" "Nearly. I only arrived today." "That's plenty of time." The old man extended a hand. "Elias Rowe. Used to be harbour master." Walter shook it. "You were polishing the lamp." "Still am." "Does it need that much polishing?" "No." Walter waited for further explanation. None came. "Do you look after the Evelyn May?" he asked. Elias's eyes moved to the boat. "Sometimes." "Who owns her?" Elias studied Walter for a moment. His expression was neither unfriendly nor welcoming. It was the look of a man deciding how much truth a stranger should be allowed. Then he said, "She belongs here." "That doesn't quite answer the question." "It's the only answer you'll get tonight." He turned and walked away. Walter watched him disappear between the cottages. The harbour was almost dark now. A lamp came on above the cafe door. Its reflection stretched across the water, breaking into pieces with every ripple. Walter looked once more at the Evelyn May. The ropes were taut. The hatch was closed. Nothing moved on the deck. Then, just as Walter turned away, he noticed something in the stern window. A small, warm light. It glowed for no more than 2 seconds. Then it vanished. Walter returned to Rose Cottage. He locked the door, made tea, and sat in the armchair with one of his books. He read the same paragraph 4 times. At 10:30 he went upstairs. From the bedroom window he could still see the harbour. Most of the village was dark. Moonlight lay across the rooftops. The boats rose and fell gently with the tide, all except the Evelyn May. It seemed to remain perfectly still. Walter watched for several minutes. Nothing happened. He closed the curtains and climbed into bed. The unfamiliar mattress creaked beneath him. Outside, the sea murmured against the harbour wall. Walter thought of Mrs. Finch telling him that unfamiliar places were good for a person. He thought of Margaret's expression in the cafe. He thought of the men in the pub refusing to answer a simple question. And he thought of the faint music drifting from a boat everyone insisted was empty. Walter had come to Gull's Haven for a quiet week by the sea. By midnight, he was almost certain he was not going to get one.